Producer-product, parent-infant. The natural division of the family into adult and child does not explain how human society became stratified into the powerful and the powerless. True, parents wield the power of life and death over their infant offspring, but parents tend to see their children as potential equals of themselves, who will grow up to replace them in the social mass. Hence, the family embodies the spirit of equality in human society. If left to itself, the family stratifies society into the three biological classes of grandparents, parents, and children. If the society is stable, not forced to migrate, for instance, and old knowledge remains relevant, the elders possess the power. If in rapid flux, where assimilation to new experience is vital, power reverts to the parents. If parents are thwarted by military defeat, for example, followed by subjection to an occupying army, then power lies in the future, in the hands of the young. In any case, status is determined by membership in a generation. And since members normally rise from subordinate to dominant positions as a group merely by growing older, access to power is theoretically open to all. Since the infant becomes a full-fledged member of a family without any further prerequisite other than being born into it, the infant, although the product of infantificers, that is, of artificers of infants, is considered by them to be a person, not a thing. A prototot, not a prototype. A producer, not a product. Is, in other words, treated as a potential equal of the agents responsible for its production. Conversely, the infant is depersonalized into a thing to the extent that the agents of its production utilize it in a manner incompatible with its potential for equality. The most extreme case of depersonalization among humans is cannibalism, where the parent utilizes the child as food. Forced incest by the parent of the child is a survivable but no less reprehensible denial of the potential for equality of the child, that is, in the case of incest, of denial of a child's freedom to engage in sex, when the time comes, with whomever it chooses. If, however, the parents themselves fall short of equality with their own peers, with, that is, parents who are of their own generation, owing to the fact that a dominant class of families has denied the potential for equality of a subjugated class of families, and hence treats the members of the subjugated class as things instead of persons, and a similar stratification likewise obtains between the respective children of the two classes, so that for the subjugated parent to treat its offspring as the potential equal of itself is in fact to condition it to submit to abuse from members of the dominant class, and thus to become the agents of the destruction of the freedom of its very own children. The more intensely it strives to nurture that freedom. If, in short, one class of families is privileged to abuse another class of families, an abuse which need not appear conspicuous since it is programmed into the system, we cannot justifiably trace the cause of this vicious hierarchy to the family. No. The cause of the disturbance lies outside the family, in the larger social structure, even if evidence of disturbance is dramatically clear within the family itself. Equality between family members, then, depends for validation on equality between families. The equality for which the child has potential is the equality of its parents with its peers. If the peers are unequal, then equality becomes a utopian as distinct from an actual ideal. A camouflage for coercive power relations, which wrecks home life and corrupts street life. The etymology of umpire. The Oxford Dictionary says a non-peer, unpeer. That is, paradoxically, one who is very much a peer or social equal of two contesting parties, but not paired up or personally associated with either of them. How language twists and turns to keep us straight. Here's another example of the twisting and turning of language. Marx and Engels refer to the leadership of the proletarian class as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Grammatically speaking, the noun proletariat can function either as subject of the phrase, that is, the proletariat commands the society, which is the meaning Marx and Engels intended, or as object of the phrase, that is, someone dictates to the proletariat, which is what historically happened in Russia. Dictatorship of the proletariat. The grammatical parallels the political equivocation. Sometimes language mirrors reality, sometimes it innovates it. A word from a word watcher. Quote, I am a fanatical lover of liberty, avows Michael Bakunin. Of that liberty of each man, which does not find another man's freedom a boundary, but a confirmation and vast extension of his own. Liberty through solidarity in equality. Unquote. All right. Suppose no one in isolation can successfully defend his or her liberty without seeking the aid of others of like mind. So, the liberty of the individual stagnates if liberty does not proliferate, if individuals do not extend that liberty to an increasing number of individuals who combine into associations devoted to the defense of the liberty of each, even or especially against the coercive power of the association to restrict the freedom of each. The ultimate freedom, then, is to be at liberty to refuse to join an association devoted to the defense of liberty. But that's a contradiction. I mean, to join or not a group dedicated to defending the freedom of any member against the tyranny of all groups, including itself. A contradiction because the group both affirms and denies itself. Is this some kind of specious logic, or is it a genuine rent in the fabric of the philosophy of freedom? I don't know. Therefore, let me once again return to the simple association of a couple fucking to determine how the logic pans out. We suppose the couple to be a two-member association dedicated to the right of each member to experience sexual orgasm in any manner which does not interfere with the mutual right of the other. Suppose further that the two lovers pretend, that is, create and sustain the fiction, that when they come, they experience a common orgasm shared between them. And if they come at different times, the orgasm is agreed to have a head and a tail. The shared orgasm being a fiction no more fantastic than the illusion produced by two singers that a single voice has shimmered into two-part harmony. In reality, however, each lover produces his or her orgasm. So, unless each is able to orgasm independently, they cannot convincingly sustain the fiction of a common orgasm. Therefore, each defends the right of the other to enter independently the house of orgasm, so that once they are assembled within, they can consecrate to their deeply and mutually felt equality this ghostgasm, which reverberates throughout the house. I think the speculation has dead-ended. I still can't see how to resolve the issue of preventing the contract voluntarily entered upon from bounding the freedom of the parties to the contract. I can't come. Don't wait for me. Perhaps the wave you make will unground me. Meanwhile, I'll gather the loose ends. As applied to the lovers in our example, the ideology of anarchy stresses the naturalness of their equal independence. The ideology of communism, on the other hand, emphasizes the collaborative fiction of their unity, for they are united only because they voluntarily choose to pretend to be. The fiction of their unity is a product of their freedom. If, however, their unity seems real because inevitable, then it would appear to exist independently of them. In fact, it could be used as a weapon against them, as a Joseph Stalin turns a political party dedicated to revolution against its members. Anyhow, when the lovers reach orgasm, the pleasure belongs to both broth. At the moment of orgasm, the bed belongs to both, the room, the house, the city, the state, the world belongs to both. But both implies equally distinct as well as equally indistinct from each other. Equally distinct with respect to having different bodies, equally indistinct with respect to choosing to experience the bodies as if they were one. I can draw a conclusion. The participants are free to restrict each other's freedom, but the participants must impose restrictions on each other with the intention of ensuring that the freedom of each is equally restrained. It is the equality of restraint that ensures the mutual freedom of each. The fear in my gut wreathes round a finger pointing toward freedom, thickens into a hard-on pointing with pleasure. The abstract desire for immediate effectiveness, writes Guy Debord, accepts the laws of the ruling thought, the exclusive point of view of the present, when it throws itself into reformist compromises or trashy pseudo-revolutionary common actions. Thus, the law of the ruling thought reappears in the very posture which pretends to fight it. Unquote. Quote, for a class to be ripe for hegemony, that is leadership, means that its interests and consciousness enable it to organize the whole of society in accordance with those interests. George Lukács. If I have to choose between the two, I'd rather sprawl like a pig than stand like a pork roast. The value of everyone, A, far exceeds, B equals, C is less than the value of anyone to him or herself. The value of anyone to him or herself, A, exceeds, B equals, C is less than the value of everyone. I don't know. Suppose an anthill contains 10,000 ants. If it's a communist anthill, then all the ants are equal. But if all the ants are equal, then each ant is worth 1/10,000th of the anthill. Hence, 2 ants are worth twice as much as 1 ant. 3 are worth 3 times as much, and 10,000 ants are worth 10,000 times more than 1. On the other hand, if it's an anarchist anthill, then each ant is worth to itself the value of all the ants put together. Each ant, then, is worth 10,000 ants to itself. Hence, 1 ant is equal to 2 ants, 3 ants, or even to 10,000 ants. Now my question is an anarcho-communist anthill theoretically possible? Can the two value systems be made to agree? For if an ant is worth 10,000 ants to itself, but it numbers itself among those 10,000, then one self-same ant equals in value 10,000 and 1/10,000th ants. To myself, swears the ant, I am worth an anthill. To the anthill, I am worth 1/10,000th of itself. The communist concept is based on a body count. That's not surprising, since the thrust of Marxist theory is economic. And so its bias is objective. It deals with physical power. If all bodies are equal, then two bodies being twice as strong as one are worth twice the value of one. The anarchist concept is based on self-irreplaceability. Its bias is subjective. Each ant is irreplaceable to itself. That's what an ant means when it says that its value to itself is worth 10,000 ants. In fact, its value to itself is without limit. Now suppose all the ants meet, that is, 5 billion people on the phone with each other. Not impossible if we invest commonwealth in building an omnication system. And agree with respect to ants only, mice and worms to follow, that 10,000 equals 1/10,000th. That means that the power of the anthill stands behind and vindicates the claim of each ant to be worth an anthill to itself. Each speaks with the authority of 10,000 ants. Hence, in an ant dispute, the anthill is conceived as quarreling with itself. That's the fiction. Now, when a person argues with him or herself, the disputatious voices are considered initially, at any rate, to be of equal persuasive force. Otherwise, there'd be no dispute. If I am of two different minds about something, I divide equally into two. If of three different minds, then equally into three, and so forth. Finally, when I make a decision, the alternatives are not so much dismissed as suspended until I see if I was right. Likewise with the ants. If 3 ants favor opinion A, but 53 ants favor opinion B, the anthill is conceived of as being in conflict with itself. And since all 56 ants, being equally invested in the anthill, are equally interested in learning which opinion is correct, the dispute, as with all ant issues, resolves itself into the question, which shall we try first? For ants are guided by the belief that since their society is not based on class conflict, and so they need not be relentlessly plagued by conflicting interests, one of which must always dominate the other if anything is to get done, the majority doesn't so much rule as schedule. Therefore, in our example, the ants resolve to implement opinion B, held by 53 ants, but only after establishing a reasonable deadline for reconsidering whether opinion B was, after all, the right way to go. So, the fact that each ant is officially worth 10,000 ants ensures its freedom. But each ant is also worth 1/10,000th of the anthill. That means that each receives an equal amount of ant commonwealth. Its 1/10,000th value ensures its equality. Anarcho-communism, CHOCO for short. If the fiction is agreeable, it's the only realpolitik. Note 1. The fact that each ant is equally invested in the anthill assures that no conflict of interest can ever supersede the primary interest of each in preserving the equality of investment of each in the anthill. On the other hand, A conflict of interests that presupposes the inequality of the rivals guarantees that however much each side is willing to compromise, the rivalry, and hence the conflict arising from the rivalry, will ultimately remain irreconcilable, since no equally shared interest, which might resolve the conflict, is theoretically possible, so long as inequality remains an essential condition, as with the American Constitution. More about that in the future. Note 2. The argument that some ants contribute more than others to the commonwealth and so should be more highly compensated than others is refuted this way. By contributing more, you must mean that in some manner, whether by being more skillful or more industrious, the person who contributes more is somehow more alive than the other who contributes less. But, and here we give priority to the anarchist subjective principle over the communist objective one, since each is equally alive to him or herself, the notion that someone is more alive than another we find as abhorrent, because it is the basis of inequality and privilege, as the present age finds incredible the notion that each is equally alive to him or herself. As Marx says, writes George Lukács, the proletariat must become a class, not only as against capital, but also for itself. That is to say, the class struggle must be raised from the level of economic necessity to the level of conscious aim and effective class consciousness. Unquote. Just to keep it straight, anarchy versus hierarchy, communism versus capitalism. And just as capitalism is the economic means for maintaining hierarchy, so communism is the economy of choice of anarchy. The higher consciousness of a class is born from an ideological womb, which nourishes and supports that consciousness even while it remains embryonic. But just as there are false pregnancies, so there are false ideologies. In the following passage from Revolution of Everyday Life, Raoul Vaneigem, one of the leading theorists of the 1960s rebellion in France, stigmatizes just such false ideologies as counter-revolutionary, since, under the pretext of being culturally radical, they constrict subjectivity, suppress feeling, and inhibit action that liberates the spirit. Quote, this adventure of the Hermit of Rodez, that is, of Antonin Artaud, has an ominous ring. Artaud's break with the surrealist movement is significant. He reproached the group for allying itself with Bolshevism, for putting itself at the service of a revolution, and a revolution caked with the blood of Kronstadt, instead of putting the revolution at its own service. Artaud is absolutely right in attacking surrealism's failure to found its revolutionary coherence on its most fruitful demand, on the primacy it accorded subjectivity. But no sooner had he made his break with surrealism than he completely lost himself in solipsistic ravings and magical thought. He abandoned all notion of realizing subjective will through the transformation of the world. In other words, having a feeling about something is too vague to indicate the ramifications of what you actually feel. Only by acting out that feeling in the world and observing how you feel about that, whether exhilarated or depressed, can you know the meaning of what you felt in the first place. To continue the quote. Instead of externalizing what lies within, Artaud sought to make it holy and to discover a permanent mythic reality in the rigid world of symbols. The only road to this kind of revelation is the road of impotence. Those who hesitate to cast out the flames that devour them from within can only burn, can only be themselves consumed in accordance with the laws of consumption, in ideology's tunic of nessus. Ideology, be it the ideology of drugs, art, psychoanalysis, theosophy, or revolution, is the one thing that never changes history in the slightest." Unquote. In contrast to Van Agem, who focuses on the liberation of the individual rather than on the liberation of a social class, Lukács considers ideology indispensable because it is indeed the womb out of which the new world is born. Quote, "Ideology for the proletariat is no banner to follow into battle, nor is it a cover for its true objectives. It is the objective and the weapon itself. Every non-principled or unprincipled use of tactics on the part of the proletariat debases historical materialism to the level of mere ideology and forces the proletariat to use bourgeois or petty bourgeois tactics. It thereby robs it of its greatest strength by forcing class consciousness into the secondary or inhibiting role of a bourgeois consciousness instead of the active role of a proletarian consciousness." Unquote. In other words, knowing your final destination is indispensable to knowing where you are at any particular time. "The only question at issue," writes Lukács, "is how much the proletariat has to suffer before it achieves ideological maturity, before it acquires a true understanding of its class situation and a true class consciousness." In the short term, adds Lukács, the bourgeoisie is concerned above all to impose its mode of life upon the day-to-day actions of the proletariat. In this respect, its superiority of organization is clearly visible, while the wholly different organization of the proletariat, its capacity for being organized as a class, cannot become effective. Unquote. Capitalism sacrifices the rights of persons to the rights of property because property lasts longer than people. The transmission of property via inheritance, generation after generation, structures society, puts control of society in the hands of the owners of property. In comparison with property, a person who dies when his or her body gives out has no endurance. The person contributes to the content of society, but doesn't alter its structure, except in the case of revolution, when one generation en masse expresses the accumulated grievances of its predecessors, gets massively personal with proprietary folk. According to Lukács, the slogan, originally a battle cry of the Scottish clan, you can hear the word slay, S-L-A-Y, that is to kill, in slogan. The slogan is the art form of revolution, according to Lukács. Quote, "Knowledge becomes action," he writes. "Theory becomes battle slogan. The masses act in accordance with the slogans and join the ranks of the organized vanguard more consciously, more steadfastly and in greater numbers. The correct slogans give rise organically to the premises and possibilities of even the technical organization of the fighting proletariat, the fighting Irish. Lukács wrote this in the 1920s, and we remember Notre Dame, the football team. And Perils of Pauline, when the woman tied to the log as it approaches the saw in the sawmill, must be rescued in a moment, or everything is lost. So that was the spirit of revolution in the 1920s. Things have changed since then. The current pharmaceutical ad, "We put people before profit," is a kind of slogan, but an ingratiating and false one. Here's how we correct it. Don't put people before profit. That way we all go broke. And certainly don't put profit before people, because eventually people turn on you and fuck you up. When everyone profits equally, the people profit. Profit people. Own the economy in common. Owner of the machine, operator of the machine, machine owner, machinist, machinator, machinated, commander and comanche, captain and decapitated, Uncle Manfred, Cousin Gerbil. The generations appear and seat themselves in the abstraction. Two classes, pilots and wing beaters. Ownership brings the privilege of piloting. Labor, the convenience of beating instead of falling to one's death. The party, writes Lukács, must immerse its own truth in the spontaneous mass movement and raise it from the depth of economic necessity, where it was conceived, onto the heights of free, conscious action. In so doing, it will transform itself. In the moment of the outbreak of revolution, from a party that makes demands to one that imposes an effective reality. In the light of the catastrophic fate of the Russian Communist Party, one should perhaps apply Lukács' words, as I say, to the bloc party rather than the political party. Furthermore, the vanguard leads from within the mass, like Jonah in the whale, not in advance like a column of fire. The vanguard is simply the undigested part of the mass, the poison that triggers the peristalsis. It's the last to upchuck into the lap of the gods. Since the owner of the machine commands, operates, the operator of the machine, the owner considers the operator as part of the machine, as a thing. The finger on the switch is part of the switch. The rest of the worker a finger holder. The owner considers the operator human to the extent that the operator may in the future buy the machine and him or herself become an owner. Under capitalism, then, humanness is a privilege, not a right. Moreover, and contradictorily, one rises from the class of things and enters the class of humans, that is, to the class of controllers of things, to the extent that one reduces people to the status of things, that is, to the extent that one dehumanizes them. And if one both owns and operates the machine, one splits in two. Now, if one expresses genuine sympathy only among equals, for by definition the sympathy of one person for another is an acknowledgement by that person of the same human quality shared by both, then dissolving the equality can't help but produce an active dehumanizer and a passive dehumanee. Therefore, under capitalism, neither owner nor worker is human. At best, the owner is a superior owning thing. At all times, the worker is an inferior owned thing. All that individuals can do during a social revolution, warns Michael Bakunin, qualifying Lukács's notion of the party, is formulate, clarify, and propagate ideas expressing the instinctive desires of the people, and contribute their constant efforts to the revolutionary organization of the natural powers of the masses. This and nothing more. All the rest can be accomplished only by the people themselves. Otherwise, we would end up with a political dictatorship, the reconstitution of the state, with all its privileges, inequalities, and oppressions. By taking a devious but inevitable path, we would come to reestablish the political, social, and economic slavery of the masses." Unquote. What would dialectic be without Marx and Bakunin? Without the spirit of history and the history of the spirited? Without economic equality imposed from below and individual freedom imposed from within? Long live anarcho-communism. Long live a love of work that is indistinguishable from a work of love. In ancient times, the slave was referred to as instrumentum vocali, as the utensil with a voice. Eventually the slave reasoned that just as where there is smoke there is fire, so where there is a voice, there's a mouth, a hand, a heart, a brain, a person. In modern times, the slave is referred to as hired help. The word hire, H-I-R-E, derives from Old English hyr, H-Y-R, which means to hear. So the hired help hears the command. It does not speak or deliver it. It helps on command. Eventually, the hired help reasoned that just as where there is smoke there is fire, so where they are all ears, but are commanded to help themselves, it must be their own voice they hear. In fact, where is the mind, brilliant as it may be, asked Bakunin? Where are the intellects powerful enough to embrace the infinite multiplicity and diversity of real interests, aspirations, wishes, and needs which sum up the collective will of the people? Hey man, this is what the capitalists refer to as the mob. And now, listen to what they're really like. And to invent a social organization that will not be a Procrustean bed upon which the violence of the state will more or less overtly force unhappy society to stretch out. It has always been thus, and it is exactly this old system of organization by force that the social revolution should end, by granting full liberty to the masses, the groups, the communes, the associations, and to the individuals as well, by destroying once and for all the historic cause of all violence, which is the power, and indeed the mere existence of the state." Unquote. The state is violent because by means of it, a privileged class, currently a wealthy owning class, imposes its will on an underprivileged class, the poor and middling. On the other hand, where all are equally invested in the wealth produced by all, the state is no more violent than 3 million couples dancing with each other on the same dance floor. By virtue of legal title to the ownership of the machine, the owner enjoys the privilege, as I stated above, of dictating the behavior of the operator of the machine. And the dictatorship over the machinist continues just so long as the machine is run at a profit. Should, however, the machine operate at a loss and the owner go bankrupt, the owner must abdicate his or her position in the hierarchy, having proven him or herself incompetent to continue to dominate subordinates. So the message of capitalism to the owner is, your reward for showing a profit is a renewal of your license to dominate. End of message. Hence, the psychological enrichment which flows from economic success is the desperate but for all that no less gratifying satisfaction of maintaining a dominant instead of dominated public posture, of publicly raping someone instead of being raped. And the rapee must submit, because the only ethical choice allowed it under capitalism is whether to be raped according to the book or unprecedentedly. If I have described the situation correctly, then the will to dominate motivates the effort to show a profit. The profit authorizes the domination, but does not motivate it. What then motivates the domination? What historically, at any rate, has motivated one person, nation, social class to dominate another is not greed, is not the bottomless fear of never having enough, nor is it to gratify some irresistible will to power, that is, domination as an end in itself, but purely and simply hatred of labor, not of the work of love, but of endless repetitive labor, whether mental or physical, which wastes the body and stupefies the mind. How do we eliminate endless repetitive labor? By automating it. Automation lightens oppressive labor, but unless we own the machines, we're out of work. Oh, why make a fuss, I hear you ask. Everyone dies, even the people who fuck us up. Isn't that vengeance enough? No, it's not. Because only the proletariat, only we are born for death. The revolution, in fact, will be the first life we know. Thus, with the rise of capitalism, the hierarchical juggernaut grandly thieved by the bourgeoisie from the aristocracy, yes, I mean this socially stratified world, this trashy and disgusting monument to the best people, the beautiful people, for their successful running to ground of the slobs, the idiots, anything to get out of doing their fair share of the work, disagreeable as it is, so that all of us can knock off early and go home, oh utopian dream, together. This hierarchical juggernaut, I say, is not junked by the newly triumphant bourgeoisie, but rebuilt on the scientific principle that the iron law of profit and loss determines rank in the hierarchy and not the caprice of a king. But really, all that's happened, as Marx so cogently saw, is that the science of bourgeois economics has replaced theology as the source of myth and bluff to obfuscate the domination, as usual, of piss-offs over peons.